Hello, this is Dr. Pasion-Gonzales, and I want to talk with you today about Chapter 1 and some of the key points that I think you need to pay attention to. Okay? Now, first of all, understand that psychology as a field is still relatively new, right? We're talking 150 years since the beginning of this thing, and it's evolving rapidly. So, to have one chapter that reviews the whole history of psychology, there isn't going to be an easy way for you to remember all of the major players and all of the major developments. So there's really just a few key players and events that I want you to be clear about. As you go through the chapter, be sure that you can identify, understand the differences between objective introspection and structuralism and functionalism, and just be able to tie a name to some of those areas. Okay. For example, structuralism with Titchener, he believed that every experience can be broken down into its individual emotions and sensations, right? And that's a little bit different from functionalism. And William James, who is often seen as the father of psychology, um, for functionalism, he was interested more in how the mind allows people to function in the world, right? How they work and adapt to their surroundings, right? So he was more interested in how it benefits us, right? Where with Titchener, he was more interested in really trying to break down the things that we experience into their smallest pieces, right? So structural pieces versus how functional people can be with in dealing with their world. Okay, um, you're going to want to be familiar with the idea of Gestalt psychology, right? And particularly be able to think about it how it's different from the structural view, right? So, uh, Werdemeyer is seen as the father of Gestalt psychology, and whereas in structuralism was trying to break everything down into its basic components or parts, the Gestalt was really looking at just the opposite, right? That the idea of, you've probably heard before, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? That is sort of the essence of Gestalt psychology. And particularly later on in the semesters, we start looking at the neuropsychology of perception and some of those kinds of things. There's some really interesting examples of how our brain fills in the gaps, so to speak, um, in many different ways, because our brain doesn't like to not know what's going on, right? And so our brain is trying to help us continually to make sense of the world. And so this idea of our brain looking for a gestalt, a meaning, some logical order to things, is something that really seems to guide our everyday thinking. Now, the real heart of this is just having an understanding of the 7 modern perspectives on psychology. Now, you have to understand, right, from a psychotherapy perspective, we have well over 500 different types of psychotherapy that people practice currently. And the thing that I want you to recognize about this is, if we had the single right approach for everybody, we wouldn't need 500 different types of therapy. We would need 3, right? That worked really, really well. So I want you to keep in mind that as we go over some of these perspectives, whether it's the psychodynamic, behavioral perspective, humanistic perspective, etc., that they really are just that. They are theories, they are models, they are perspectives. We're not talking about truth here. We're not talking about scientific facts. The question to ask isn't who's right and who's wrong. The better question, I think, is, when does it make most sense to refer to one perspective, or take elements of that to help us understand the world? Okay. But you ought to be able to at least name the seven perspectives, right? The psychodynamic perspective, the behavioral perspective, the humanistic perspective, cognitive perspective, also the social cultural perspective, biological perspective, and the evolutionary perspective. So I'm going to need you to at least memorize what those seven things are. And what I would suggest, find a good mnemonic, find a rhyming scheme, or find the acronyms that you can put together. Right, just find some simple system that is going to make sense to you to be able to remember each of those perspectives, and be able to give me a one sentence brief description of basically what that's like. And you can get that from the book. If you look at table 1.1, it gives you a nice simple overview of these perspectives, along with some of the key players. So I would make sure that table 1.1, makes sense to you. So we're going to go over some of these different perspectives, but I'm not going to go over page by page, what you can cover in the book. When you're thinking psychodynamic in terms of the heart of this, right, this really comes out of Freud's work. And you have to understand at that time there wasn't really a scientific approach to all of this, right? So what's most interesting to me about Freud and the psychodynamic perspective, for me personally, is the idea that everything that we're conscious of is not everything that actually goes into our brain, and it's not everything that we respond to. There is a whole lot going on under the surface, right? Much like an iceberg, right? You have the consciousness at the tip, but underneath there's a whole lot going on. And I think Freud very keenly and astutely, recognized that that's a powerful force. And I think we're foolish and arrogant to believe that everything that we think about, everything that we feel, is only based upon what we can consciously be aware of. It's interesting, even in some of the other perspectives, from a biopsychological perspective, the idea that there's other forces outside of our awareness that influence us is fun, and it's interesting, because that's where you begin to see people who begin to measure that in real ways. So his ideas were kind of out there, but he was a real revolutionary. Okay. With the behavioral perspective, think about Watson and think about Skinner. Make sure that their contributions. What I really appreciate about the behavioral perspective is how applicable it is to so many situations in our lives, from training our dogs to raising our children to even being good in any of our relationships, right? If we want to get along well, and if we want to have an influence on people, we need to understand, conditioning, reinforcement, the role that punishment, the right kind of punishment, how that affects behavior. So the contribution in terms of day-to-day life from the behavioral perspective, in my opinion, can't be overstated. Now, we will get into more details later in the semester of how some of those behavioral approaches work out, but it's good stuff. The humanist perspective. If you were involved in the psychology world at that time, you were either a psychodynamic thinker or you were a behaviorist, and that was it. So it was really refreshing to have this new approach, to really broaden things out. And in the therapy world, all the 500 plus ways to do therapy in this world, the single variable that is the best predictor of therapeutic outcomes is going to be our relationship, and that really comes out of this perspective. So it deserves to be part of the seven perspectives of modern psychology. The cognitive perspective really took hold much later, probably the 1960s or so, and it was really an attempt to better understand the processes of how we think. And if we get some time, I really want to share with you some of the ideas that kind of spawned out of this more recently, known as a behavioral economics. Right? the idea that we as humans make very predictable errors in how we think and how we predict things. And that is very interesting to me. So I'm hoping that we'll get a chance to take a closer look at that as well. Now, the social perspective really looks at some of the external factors that shape how we think and how we interact with people and how we're impacted by the people around us and our culture. Just as an example, when I worked at the Naval Air Base here in Lemoore, I would often see the junior sailors talking to each other casually, joking around the way that young sailors do, right? And then a senior officer would walk past, and you would see their bearing change immediately, right? All the joking would stop. They would stand up straighter. Yes, sir. No, sir. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. And as soon as that senior officer left, they would relax, go back to their normal, way of interacting and joking, right? So I like this as an example that even though we're the same person all the time, we don't act the same way. We don't talk the same way. We don't even think the same way in every setting, in every arena of our lives. The biopsychological perspective really looks at the biological structures and functioning that supports our behavior and our thinking process. And to me, this is really quite intriguing, right? I think about this as if you get a new toy, right, whether it's a computer or a camera or gadget gizmo thing, the biopsychological perspective is really as pushing all the buttons, right, reading the manual, breaking this thing down, looking at all of the new functions that this new toy can do. And in the biopsychological model, that's our brain, right? How does our brain function? Why does it function? What happens at a neurological level? What happens at a chemical level, at electrical impulse level, right? That literally impacts how we think and what we do. We cannot separate who we are, our identity, our sense of who we are as a person, right? Without appreciating the machine or the structure that this identity sits in. Because it's this machine, especially our brain and our senses and our nervous system, that we interact with the world, right, in any form. So I think this is a really relevant perspective. The last perspective is the evolutionary perspective, and it's really kind of different from like the behavioral perspective or even the cognitive perspective, right? Which really is just trying to zero in with a very very tight lens to to see what's going on inside the person. This perspective is really zooming out, right, and really looking at how does anything we do, what's common to people, and how is it functional for all human beings, right? And so it's really taken a very macro view of human beings. The thing that I want to remind you about this perspective and all of these perspectives, these are all theories, they're all metaphors, they're all models, they're all ways of thinking about the world, of thinking about ourselves. None of them really are about scientific fact, right? Even though we're getting better at using scientific research to help us understand ourselves from one of these models. But all of them really are about ways for us to understand ourselves better and to understand the world around us better. So that's that. Read through the chapter, pay attention to your modules, take the quizzes in Revel, pull out your study guide, and look at your discussion board for chapter 1. Let me know if you have any questions that come up as you read the material. Okay? All right, thanks. Talk to you soon.